Hello friends, how are you feeling tonight? I hope your body is relaxed and your mind is calm. If sleep feels far away, this story might help you drift gently into rest. Tonight, we're traveling back to the age of knights and kings, to the distant lands of medieval Europe, where the clash of swords, the honor of chivalry, and the daring campaigns of legendary figures like Richard the Lionheart and Saladin unfolded. We'll witness epic battles, daring crusades, and moments of courage, strategy, and unexpected humanity. From fortified castles and bustling medieval cities to the deserts of the Holy Land, you'll experience the sights, sounds, and stories that shaped this remarkable era. As you listen, allow yourself to be carried through the pages of history, feeling the tension of battles, the quiet of negotiation, and the awe of unforgettable events. So, get comfortable, let your eyes grow heavy, and journey with me through a world of knights, honor, and legend. Stay with the story until the very end, and you might find your mind gently drifting toward rest as the tales of bravery and wisdom unfold. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe so you to miss more calming historical stories that guide you into peaceful sleep. Tonight we journey back to the long and shadowed centuries we call the Middle Ages, a time that stretched across 1,000 years of European history. From the fall of Rome to the dawn of the Renaissance, a world of kings and peasants, monks and merchants, knights and pilgrims bound together by faith, fear, and the rhythms of the land. The medieval world was a place of deep contrasts, where soaring cathedrals lifted prayers to heaven even as plague and famine struck the villages below, where knights in glittering armor pledged their swords in service of lords and kings, while peasants bent their backs to the earth, plowing and planting from dawn until dusk, their lives shaped by the seasons more than by the politics of the distant nobility. At the heart of this world stood the church, the most powerful institution of the age, not merely a house of worship, but a vast spiritual and political force, guiding souls with promises of salvation and binding kings with the weight of divine authority. The Pope in Rome could bless a kingdom or condemn it, and from pulpits in tiny chapels, priests reminded the faithful of heaven and of hell, of sins confessed and forgiven, or left to fester in eternal fire. Life itself was precarious, and few lived long beyond 40 years. Children often never saw their 5th birthday. Disease was a constant shadow. Famine stalked the countryside in years when crops failed. Yet within that hardship, people built a culture of resilience. Faith was the anchor, and ritual filled the year, from Christmas feasts to springtime pilgrimages, from the solemn fasting of Lent to the jubilant ringing of bells at Easter. Imagine the sights and sounds of a medieval village, narrow lanes lined with timber-framed houses, smoke rising from low hearths, the air heavy with the scent of baking bread, manure, and wood smoke, chickens darting underfoot, dogs barking, children chasing each other through the mud. While at the village green, men gather to repair tools, women spin wool, and the bell from the church tower marks the rhythm of the day, calling the faithful to prayer at dawn, noon, and dusk. Above these villages, castles rose, grim and imposing, their towers and walls built not only to protect but also to dominate. For a castle was both fortress and symbol, a reminder of power etched against the sky. Within its walls, the lord's household lived in greater comfort, dining in great halls beneath rafters blackened by smoke, tapestries on the walls warding off the cold, minstrels singing of ancient heroes, while outside, soldiers drilled in the yard, their armor clanking as they practiced for war. The feudal order bound society together in a rigid chain. Kings granted land to nobles, nobles granted land to knights, and peasants worked that land in exchange for protection. Loyalty was sealed with oaths, words sworn on relics or on the cross. Honor was not simply personal, it was the very currency of power. Betrayal could shatter families, kingdoms, even Christendom itself. Yet within this world of hierarchy and duty, there was also a yearning for more, for adventure, for salvation, for glory. It was this yearning that would soon give rise to the great movements of the age, to the Crusades that drew men and women across seas and deserts, and to figures of legend, kings like Richard the Lionheart, maidens like Joan of Arc, whose stories would echo through centuries. But before we reach them, we must linger a little longer in the tapestry of daily life. For to understand the knight, the crusader, the saint, we must first understand the soil from which they sprang. Daily life in medieval Europe was simple yet ritualized. Peasants woke with the sun, their tasks dictated by the seasons, ploughing in spring, harvesting in autumn, threshing grain, gathering firewood, mending roofs before winter. Women tended gardens, raised children, spun wool, baked bread, and brewed ale. Men worked the fields, built fences, or joined the lord's hunts, and all lived by the rhythm of bells, not clocks, the sound of iron on iron, blacksmiths shaping ploughs, armourers fashioning chainmail, the ringing echoing through the villages like a heartbeat of labour. For entertainment, there were festivals, markets, and fairs, colour splashed across an otherwise grey existence. At harvest time, villages erupted in song and dance, maypoles were raised, and fiddles played into the night. Jugglers, minstrels, and storytellers wandered from town to town, carrying tales of saints and heroes, of dragons slain and maidens rescued, weaving myth and history together in the minds of those who listened. Religion infused every corner of existence. Prayers began the day, prayers ended it. Baptism welcomed the newborn, confession cleansed sins, marriage bound couples. Death was marked by solemn bells and prayers for the soul's journey into eternity. Pilgrimages were undertaken not only by the wealthy, but also by humble peasants who saved for years to walk to Santiago de Compostela, or even across the sea to Rome or Jerusalem. Faith gave meaning to hardship and promised justice beyond the grave. And yet, violence was never far. Wars between lords scarred the countryside. Bandits prowled the forests. Raiders swept in from the seas. Castles burned. Crops were trampled beneath the hooves of horses. Knights might ride to defend their lords, but peasants often bore the brunt. Famine followed war, and war was never scarce. Still, out of this soil grew ideals that remain etched in our imagination. The shining knight in armor, sworn to a code of chivalry, protector of the weak, defender of the faith. The knight's path was long and harsh. A boy began as a page, serving in the household, learning manners, the care of horses, the handling of weapons. By his teenage years, he became a squire, training under a knight, carrying his armor, learning the weight of a sword and the discipline of battle. Until, at last, in a solemn ceremony, he was dubbed a knight, rising from his knees with sword in hand and oath on his lips, bound to honor, loyalty, and courage. It was this ideal, however imperfectly lived, that came to define the Middle Ages in memory, and it was from this world of hardship and hope, of violence and vision, that figures like Richard the Lionheart and Joan of Arc would one day rise, their stories woven into the fabric of this age, as much myth as history, yet still rooted in the soil of medieval Europe. The bells of Vespers are ringing now. The evening draws near. Candles flicker in windows. A village settles into the quiet of night. Beyond the hills, a castle torch glows against the dark. And somewhere, perhaps, a young boy dreams of the day he too might bear a sword, ride a horse, and write his name in the chronicles of time. In the dawn of medieval Europe, long before Richard the Lionheart led his armies, before Joan of Arc raised her banner, there emerged a code that shaped the spirit of the knight. It was not written in law books at first, nor carved upon stone like the edicts of ancient emperors. Rather, it grew slowly, born from necessity, faith, and the desire to tame the brutal violence of a warrior class. This was the birth of chivalry, the knightly code that promised to guide steel with honor and temper might with mercy. The early medieval world was a violent place. Lords and barons warred with one another for land, power, and pride. Castles dotted the countryside, not merely as homes, but as fortresses against neighboring rivals. Knights were warriors first, often mercenaries who fought for whoever paid them. They raided villages, plundered crops, and left destruction in their wake. Yet as the church grew in strength, it sought to transform this restless energy, to turn men of blood into soldiers of God. It was in this climate that the idea of a knightly code began to take root. The word chivalry itself comes from the French chevalerie, meaning simply horsemanship. At first, it described the skills of mounted warriors, but over time it came to signify something greater, an ideal of conduct, a vision of what a knight should be. Not merely a fighter, but a defender. Not simply a killer, but a guardian. From the pulpit, priests began to preach what they called the peace of God, and later the truce of God. These were attempts to limit the violence that scarred Christendom. The peace of God forbade knights from attacking peasants, clergy, or the poor. The truce of God forbade fighting on holy days, Sundays, feast days, Lent. Though often broken, these decrees planted seeds, teaching that war, if it must be waged, had to be bound by rules higher than human will. Chivalry also drew inspiration from the stories of old, legends of King Arthur, and his Round Table, tales sung by troubadours of knights who risked all for honor, for love, for God. These romances, though part myth, fed the imagination of young squires. They dreamed not merely of wielding swords, but of embodying ideals greater than themselves. The training of a knight was long and demanding. A boy of noble birth would begin as a page, perhaps at the age of 7. Sent from his family's manor to the household of a lord, he would learn manners, horsemanship, and the basic arts of service. He carried messages, attended his lord at table, and absorbed the rhythms of noble life. More than this, he was taught humility, or at least the appearance of it, for a knight must first learn to serve before he can command. By the age of 14, the boy became a squire. Now he followed his knight into battle, carried his armor, and cared for his weapons. He trained daily with sword and lance, practiced wrestling, archery, and riding. He learned how to mount a horse while wearing heavy armor, how to tilt in the lists, how to strike and parry with precision. He also learned endurance, for armor weighed upon the body like iron chains, and battles often stretched from dawn until dusk. But alongside this martial training, the squire was taught the virtues of the code: loyalty to his lord, courtesy to women, defense of the weak, faith in God. These lessons were often idealized, and not every knight lived by them, but the expectation mattered. It shaped the culture of knighthood, giving it a moral backbone. At last came the ceremony of dubbing. On the eve of his knighthood, the squire would enter a chapel. There, he would bathe in water, symbolizing the cleansing of sin. He would fast, confess, and spend the night in vigil, kneeling before the altar with sword and shield laid beside him. As dawn broke, he would hear mass, then kneel before his lord. With a tap of the sword upon his shoulders, he would rise a knight, bound to serve God, his lord, and the ideals of his order. The ceremony itself was heavy with symbolism. The sword was blessed, a reminder that it was to be wielded not for selfish gain, but for justice. The spurs he received marked him as a rider, swift to answer the call of duty. His shield bore a coat of arms, a symbol of identity that would carry his family's honor into battle. And above all, he swore an oath to be loyal, to be brave, to protect the church, to defend the helpless, to honor women, and to fight for truth. Of course, reality often fell short of the ideal. Many knights, despite their vows, remained violent and greedy. Villages still burned, rivals were still slaughtered. Yet the code of chivalry provided a vision, a mirror against which knights were judged. It was a standard that, even when broken, reminded Christendom of what was expected. The songs of troubadours carried these ideals across Europe, in courts from France to England, from the castles of the Rhineland to the hills of Spain. Nobles listened to tales of Sir Lancelot, Roland, Tristan. These stories elevated the image of the knight, weaving together love, honor, and sacrifice. To fight bravely was good, but to fight bravely for a cause greater than oneself, that was the true measure of chivalry. Chivalry also intertwined with courtly love, a curious and often symbolic tradition. A knight might dedicate his service to a lady, pledging loyalty not only to his lord, but to a woman of noble birth. This devotion was usually expressed through poetry, gestures, and tournaments, rather than true romance. Yet it added a layer of refinement, softening the harshness of war with the grace of affection. Tournaments themselves became stages upon which chivalry was displayed. Knights rode into the lists, lances lowered, banners flying, while crowds cheered. These contests were more than sport. They were demonstrations of courage, skill, and loyalty. Victory brought prestige, and defeat brought shame. Yet always the knight was expected to fight with honor, not with cruelty. And so, through ritual, story, and practice, the knightly code took form. It was never perfect, never fully achieved, yet it gave the medieval world something precious, an ideal of how power should be used, a dream of strength in service of virtue. Without it, the knight might have remained little more than a mercenary on horseback. With it, he became a symbol, a figure who could inspire not only fear, but respect. From this soil of chivalry would rise the great names of the Middle Ages. Richard the Lionheart, whose sword carved through the Holy Land, yet whose courage was praised even by his Muslim foes. Joan of Arc, who though not a knight, embodied the chivalric ideal of faith and courage more than most armored men. And countless others whose deeds, real or imagined, gave flesh to the dream of honor on horseback. Thus, the birth of chivalry was not the end of violence nor the dawn of peace, but it was the beginning of something greater, the attempt to give meaning to war, to bind steel with conscience, to turn a warrior into a knight. And it was this code, imperfect yet enduring, that shaped the soul of medieval Europe. To understand the world of knights and crusades, one must first grasp the great structure that bound medieval Europe together, the system we call feudalism. It was not merely a political arrangement, nor simply an economic model. It was the very skeleton of society, a chain of obligations and loyalties stretching from king to peasant. Each link forged in oaths, each duty sealed by land, by service, and by faith. At the summit stood the king, crowned and anointed, ruler by divine right. Yet even his power was fragile, for unlike the emperors of Rome, medieval kings rarely commanded absolute authority. Their strength depended upon their ability to grant land, wealth, and favor to powerful lords, dukes and counts, who in turn swore loyalty and service. Without these bonds, a crown was little more than a circle of gold. Beneath the great lords stood the lesser nobility, barons, viscounts, knights. Each held estates carved from the king's realm, each bound to provide soldiers when summoned, to maintain order and to defend the church. At the lowest rung were the peasants, the vast majority of the population, tied to the soil, their lives spent in toil. They owed labor, rent, and obedience to their lords, and in return, they received protection, or at least the promise of it. This structure was not static. It was alive, shifting with war, inheritance, and politics. Yet its essence was clear, a pyramid of power, where land was the currency, loyalty the contract, and faith the glue. And at the very heart of this system stood the castle, both symbol and stronghold of feudal might. Imagine a castle rising from the landscape. In the early Middle Ages, they were often wooden motte and bailey fortresses, simple yet formidable. A mound of earth, the motte, crowned with a wooden tower, surrounded by palisades and ditches. Below, the bailey spread out, a courtyard filled with stables, workshops, and barracks. Crude though they were, these castles provided defense in a world of constant raiding. By the 12th century, however, castles had grown into towering marvels of stone. High curtain walls surrounded inner courtyards. Towers, round and square, loomed above, bristling with arches. Drawbridges spanned deep moats. Iron portcullises barred the gates. Within, great halls stretched beneath vaulted roofs, their walls hung with banners and tapestries. The lord sat upon a dais, dispensing justice, feasting with guests, or holding council with knights. To step inside was to feel the weight of power, carved into stone itself. Yet castles were not merely military bastions. They were homes, courts, and centers of administration. Inside their walls, the rhythms of daily life echoed. Kitchens roared with the sound of spits turning over fires, the smell of roasted meats filling the air. Servants hurried across stone floors, bearing trenchers of bread, jugs of ale, platters of fish. The great hall was the heart of the castle, where the lord dined with family and retainers, where minstrels sang, and where disputes were settled. Above, in chambers hung with furs, ladies wove or read psalters, and children played under the watchful eyes of tutors. But a castle was also a stage, where status was displayed. Its size and splendor proclaimed the wealth of its lord. A strong castle could defy armies, as many sieges proved. To control a castle was to control the land around it, for peasants looked to its walls for safety when raiders swept through. To lose a castle was to lose not only territory, but also honor. Thus, castles dotted the map of Europe like stars in the night sky, each a nucleus of power. Feudalism bound together these lords and castles in a web of obligations. At its core lay the oath of homage. When a vassal swore loyalty to his lord, he knelt, hands joined, and placed them within the lord's grasp. With words of solemnity, he pledged to serve, to fight, to counsel. In return, the lord granted land, a fief, and promised protection. This act was not lightly broken, for to betray one's oath was to invite dishonor, excommunication, or death. Honor was the currency of the nobility. A lord's word was as weighty as his sword. To be known as oathbreaker was to lose standing, to be despised by allies, shunned by the church. For in the medieval mind, these bonds mirrored divine order. Just as God ruled heaven and kings ruled by God's grace, so too did lords rule their vassals, and vassals serve in humble obedience. The chain was both earthly and spiritual, yet for all its order, feudalism was also fragile. Rivalries often tore it apart. A baron might rebel against his king, or lords might clash over disputed lands. Castles that once sheltered became targets of siege. Stone walls could delay an army, but rarely forever. Catapults, battering rams, and undermining tunnels wore them down. Siege was a grim art, cutting off food and water, waiting for hunger to break the defenders. For the peasants trapped inside, it meant starvation, disease, and despair. Still, castles endured as symbols of stability in a shifting world. They embodied the authority of kings and lords, the strength of knights, and the hierarchy of the feudal system. From their battlements, banners fluttered, displaying coats of arms, each design a proclamation of lineage and power. The Lion of England, the fleur-de-lis of France, the eagle of the empire. These heraldic emblems carried meaning that outlived the men who bore them. Within this order, peasants toiled endlessly, their lives marked by hardship. Bound to the land, they ploughed fields, harvested crops, tended livestock. Their homes were simple, their food plain: bread, porridge, ale, perhaps meat on feast days. Yet they too were part of the system. Their labour sustained the castles, their rents filled the lord's coffers, their prayers filled the chapels. Though their role was humble, it was essential. The church sanctified this order, teaching that every soul had its place. King, knight, priest, peasant. To rebel against one's station was to rebel against God's design. Sermons reminded peasants to obey, nobles to protect, knights to serve, priests to guide. And though injustice abounded, this vision held society together for centuries. Feudalism was not universal nor uniform. It varied from England to France, from the Holy Roman Empire to Spain. Yet its essence was shared, a web of loyalty and land centered upon the castle. From this structure emerged the figures who would dominate medieval history: crusaders, kings, saints, rebels. Richard the Lionheart himself was both product and master of this world, his reign a dance of oaths and sieges, alliances and betrayals. And so, in the shadow of castles and beneath the weight of the feudal order, medieval Europe took shape. It was a society built upon duty, faith and fear, a society that dreamed of heaven even as it fought upon earth. From this soil, the great stories of the Middle Ages sprang forth, Stories of knights who pledged their lives, of kings who sought dominion, of peasants who prayed for peace. The castle walls rise high before us now. Torches flicker along the battlements. Guards pace in the chill night air. Within the great hall, a feast resounds with laughter and music. Beyond the walls, peasants huddle in their cottages, the harvest stored, the winter long ahead. The order holds, fragile yet enduring, a chain of stone and oath, of crown and cross. And in that fragile order, the destiny of Europe will unfold. The Middle Ages were an age of faith, an age where every village steeple seemed to point toward heaven, and every peasant lord or knight lived beneath the shadow of the church's authority. To understand why the Crusades were called, and why men and women left their homes to march across continents toward Jerusalem, one must first understand the spirit of pilgrimage. In medieval Europe, life was difficult and often short. War, famine, and disease stalked the common folk. Amid this uncertainty, salvation became the central concern of the age. Pilgrimage was one of the most powerful expressions of that concern. To walk the roads to holy shrines was to take a journey not merely of miles, but of the soul. Pilgrims set out for Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, Rome, and most revered of all, Jerusalem. A peasant might trudge barefoot with a wooden staff carrying little more than bread wrapped in cloth, while a noble could ride on horseback surrounded by attendants, but both shared the same hope, that by reaching the holy places, they might cleanse their sins and draw closer to God. The road was dangerous. Thieves, wild animals, sickness, and hunger were constant companions. Yet pilgrimage flourished. Inns rose along the paths, shrines displayed relics of saints, and entire towns grew rich from the constant stream of travelers. Pilgrimage was more than individual devotion. It became a cultural force that tied far-flung regions of Europe together. A farmer from Flanders could meet a merchant from Venice on the same road, both kneeling in prayer at the same chapel. Into this world of pilgrim roads came the summons that would change Europe forever. In 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a great council at Clermont in France. The air was heavy with anticipation, for news had arrived from the east. The Byzantine Emperor, Alexios III Komnenos, faced relentless pressure from the Seljuk Turks, whose expansion threatened Constantinople itself. He sent envoys to the Pope, pleading for aid. Urban saw more than an opportunity to help a fellow Christian ruler. He saw a chance to unite the often warring knights of Europe under a single banner. Chroniclers record his words with varying details, but the essence resounded through Christendom. Christians in the East were suffering, holy places were desecrated, and the road to Jerusalem was barred. The Pope painted the task not as a mere war, but as the highest form of pilgrimage. Those who took up the cross would receive absolution of sins, their journey not merely earthly, but eternal. "God wills it!" the crowd shouted, the cry echoing in the fields of Clermont and carried across the continent. The message struck like fire upon dry wood. Knights who had spent years fighting neighbors for land or honor now had a holy cause. Younger sons with no inheritance saw an adventure that promised both glory and salvation. Merchants envisioned new markets. Peasants, too, took the cross, believing that to march to Jerusalem was to march into God's favor. Entire families sold possessions, carved crosses into their garments, and set out on the road. The concept of crusade was born at the intersection of pilgrimage and holy war. A knight could now wield his sword not just for lord or king, but for Christ himself. The church promised spiritual rewards that dwarfed earthly gain. To die on the journey was not tragedy, but triumph, a martyr's crown awaiting in heaven. Yet this holy calling was also shaped by earthly concerns. Lords saw opportunity to extend power, kings to strengthen crowns, and the papacy to assert authority over secular rulers. The call of Clermont was both deeply spiritual and unmistakably political. Faith and ambition, devotion and desire walked hand in hand. As word spread, preparations began. Blacksmiths hammered day and night to forge armor. Monks preached in marketplaces, stirring crowds with visions of Jerusalem's golden walls. Women wept as husbands and sons departed, uncertain if they would ever return. Pilgrim and warrior alike sewed crosses on cloaks, marking themselves as soldiers of Christ. Villages emptied of men, while fields went untilled. And so, the crusading host began to form, a river of humanity flowing eastward. At its heart burned the ancient idea of pilgrimage, now transformed into something larger and more fearsome. No longer was the holy journey confined to peaceful roads and sacred shrines. Now the entire world seemed a path, and the end lay in the holy sepulchre of Jerusalem. The roads through Europe filled with the sound of footsteps and hooves, the clatter of weapons and the murmur of prayers. Children clung to mothers, nobles rode beside peasants, and banners fluttered with painted crosses. It was a sight Europe had never seen before, and one that would forever alter its destiny. The Crusades would bring glory and horror, triumph and tragedy. They would create legends like Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, inspire saints and poets, and leave scars still visible centuries later. Yet in that moment of departure, when men and women first set out, the air was thick with hope. Hope that Jerusalem, the city of Christ's passion, might once again be in Christian hands. Hope that sin might be washed away through sacrifice. Hope that the road east was the road to heaven. This was the spirit that launched 1,000 journeys, that filled the ports of Venice and Genoa with sails bound for the Levant, that turned pilgrimage into crusade. And as the first waves of crusaders trudged into the unknown, they carried not only swords and shields, but the weight of Europe's faith and the dreams of salvation. The world of medieval Europe stood on the threshold of transformation. The age of the Crusades had begun. The year was 1096, when the first great tide of humanity began to roll eastward. Never before had Europe seen such a movement of people, nobles and peasants, soldiers and monks, women and children, all bound together by the symbol of the cross stitched upon their garments. What Pope Urban II had set in motion at Clermont had become reality. Yet the path ahead was neither simple nor holy in the way many imagined. The First Crusade was to be a journey of immense hardship, staggering violence, and breathtaking triumph, a tale that would reverberate across the centuries. The first waves that set out were not knights in shining mail, but peasants, poor men and women who responded to the call with raw zeal. Led by wandering preachers like Peter the Hermit, they became known as the People's Crusade. Carrying little more than staffs and simple weapons, they believed God's hand would deliver Jerusalem into their grasp. They marched in ragged columns across Europe, chanting hymns and expecting miracles. But piety could not replace discipline. Many turned to plundering as food grew scarce, and in some towns their zeal turned tragically against Jewish communities, sparking massacres along the Rhine that left deep scars. When this untrained horde finally stumbled into Anatolia, they were swiftly crushed by the Seljuk Turks. The People's Crusade ended in slaughter, but its spirit showed the power of faith to move entire populations. It was the knights and lords who followed that would carry the true weight of the First Crusade. The princes of Europe answered Urban's call with ambition and devotion. Among them was Godfrey of Bouillon, a pious duke from Lorraine, Bohemond of Taranto, a shrewd Norman adventurer, Raymond of Toulouse, a wealthy count whose age did not dim his resolve, and Hugh of Vermandois, brother of the King of France. These were men of stature, commanding armored knights, retainers and supplies. Their armies marched separately, converging on Constantinople, where Emperor Alexios Komnenos waited with unease. To the Byzantines, these Western lords were both saviors and threats. Alexios sought disciplined aid to push back the Turks, not unruly hosts who might carve new kingdoms from his empire. He demanded oaths of fealty, asking that lands reclaimed be returned to Byzantine rule. Some Crusader leaders swore reluctantly, others with silent suspicion. The seeds of mistrust were planted, seeds that would later bear bitter fruit. From Constantinople, the Crusaders crossed into Asia Minor. The march was brutal. Summer heat baked the land, water was scarce, and the Turkish cavalry struck like lightning, harassing the columns and vanishing into the hills. Yet the Crusaders endured, their iron discipline and stubborn faith carrying them onward. At Dorylaeum in 1097, they faced a vast Seljuk force. For hours, the knights were pressed to breaking point, their lines collapsing under arrows and charges. Then Bohemon's cry rang out, and fresh cavalry arrived to strike the Turks in the flank. The field turned, the enemy routed. For the first time, the Crusaders tasted victory in the east. Their path led next to Antioch, a city of immense walls and strategic importance. The siege lasted months, testing every ounce of resolve. Hunger gnawed, disease spread, and men whispered of desertion. Yet visions and relics inspired hope. When a mysterious monk claimed to discover the Holy Lance, said to have pierced Christ's side, morale surged. At last, betrayal opened a gate, and the Crusaders poured in, seizing Antioch in a storm of blood and fire. Yet no sooner had they taken the city than a new enemy army arrived, surrounding them in turn. Trapped and starving, the Crusaders fought with a desperation born of faith. Against all odds, they broke out, driving their foes before them. Antioch was theirs, though at a terrible cost. From Antioch, the weary host pressed on toward Jerusalem. By the summer of 1099, after years of toil and thousands of miles, the holy city rose before them. For many, tears filled their eyes at the sight of the walls glinting in the sun. Yet Jerusalem was not to be given, but taken. The city's defenders were strong, its fortifications daunting. The Crusaders, reduced in number, half-starved and battered by years of war, prepared for the final struggle. On July 15th, 1099, after days of desperate assault, the Crusaders stormed the walls. Godfrey of Bouillon, clad in mail and surging with unyielding will, led the charge. Siege towers rolled forward, ladders scraped against stone, and knights clambered into the breach. Soon the gates fell. What followed was fury unchained. Chroniclers tell of slaughter that spared neither soldier nor civilian, Christian nor Muslim, Jew nor pagan. Blood ran in the streets of Jerusalem, staining the holy city in carnage. To the Crusaders, this was divine judgment. To later ages, it was a shadow that darkened their triumph. When the killing ended, the Crusaders gathered barefoot in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, tears mixing with dust and blood, singing hymns of thanksgiving. They had done what seemed impossible, seized Jerusalem and raised the cross where once the crescent flew. Godfrey refused to wear a king's crown in the city where Christ had worn thorns. Instead, he styled himself Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. A new Christian kingdom was born, the first of several Crusader states carved from the Levant. The First Crusade had succeeded beyond all expectation. A ragged host of knights and peasants, driven by faith and ambition, had torn a path across continents and seized the most contested city on earth. Yet their victory carried contradictions. They had marched as pilgrims, but fought as conquerors. They claimed holiness, yet left trails of fire and blood. For Europe, the crusade was both triumph and sin, a story of devotion and destruction entwined. The memory of the First Crusade blazed across Christendom. Songs were sung, chronicles penned, relics displayed. Knights looked upon it as the highest model of holy war, while peasants saw it as proof that the lowliest could share in God's work. The success would call forth new crusades in the centuries to come, each seeking to match the glory of that first wave, though few would ever achieve such startling victory. For now, Jerusalem lay in Christian hands, and the world was forever changed. The Crusaders returned to Europe with tales of distant lands, strange peoples, and divine triumph. The Holy City stood at the center of Christendom's dreams. But beneath the hymns of victory, shadows stirred, for the East had not yielded forever. A great struggle had begun, one that would shape the fate of knights, kings, and empires for generations. In the long gallery of medieval kings, few shine with the same fierce brilliance as Richard the Thin of England, known to history as Richard the Lionheart. His name resounds like a trumpet blast, a figure of courage and conquest, celebrated in ballads and chronicles alike. Yet to understand the man behind the legend, one must trace his path from childhood to crown, from restless youth to warrior king. shaped by the tumult of his age and the fire in his soul. Richard was born in 1157 in Oxford, the third son of King Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine. His cradle lay at the crossroads of power, for his parents were among the most formidable rulers of their time. Henry, stern and tireless, sought to forge a vast Angevin empire stretching from the highlands of Scotland to the vineyards of southern France. Eleanor, cultured and formidable, brought with her the glittering legacy of Aquitaine, a land of troubadours, poetry, and courts steeped in refinement. From them, Richard inherited both iron and silk, his father's relentless drive and his mother's taste for the chivalric arts. As a boy, Richard's destiny was not certain. With two elder brothers ahead of him, he seemed unlikely to inherit a crown. Yet the halls of medieval royalty were rife with ambition and rivalry. Henry II's sons were restless, brimming with pride and resentment. Richard's youth was marked by rebellions against his father, rebellions in which he fought not only for land, but for identity. Even as a teenager, he proved himself a commander, leading troops in Aquitaine with fierce skill. Chroniclers described him as tall, strong, with flowing hair and a commanding presence, a figure who inspired loyalty and fear alike. He earned his name, Lionheart, not merely for bravery in battle, but for the sheer ferocity with which he hurled himself into danger. In tournaments, he unhorsed the finest knights of Europe. In sieges, he stood at the front lines, scaling ladders, sword flashing, his voice carrying above the din. He lived for war, for the clash of arms, for the test of courage. Yet his valor was matched by a temper as sharp as his blade. He quarreled with his father, defied his brothers, and clashed with nobles who balked at his iron will. When Henry II died in 1189, Richard ascended the throne of England, though in truth he felt more at home in France than on the misty island realm. Almost immediately, he turned his gaze eastward. For news had come that Jerusalem, the jewel of Christendom, had fallen to Saladin after the catastrophic defeat of Christian forces at Hattin in 1187. The cry for a new crusade swept across Europe, and Richard, knight to the marrow, answered with fervor. The Third Crusade would become Richard's stage, his proving ground, the arena where his legend was forged. He poured treasure into outfitting ships and armies, levying taxes and demanding contributions from nobles and commoners alike. His departure was as much spectacle as strategy, with banners unfurled, trumpets blaring, and thousands marching beneath the cross. Yet even in his preparations, Richard revealed his dual nature, devout in his cause, ruthless in his methods. He journeyed first to Sicily, where intrigue awaited. The island was a gateway to the east, and Richard's arrival shook its politics. He seized control of Messina after disputes with the local ruler, his fleet battering the harbour, his soldiers storming the city. Here, as elsewhere, Richard showed that diplomacy was never his chosen weapon. His strength lay in steel, and he wielded it without hesitation. From Sicily, he sailed to Cyprus, where betrayal again drew his wrath. The island's ruler had mistreated shipwrecked crusaders, and Richard descended upon him with fury. In weeks, he conquered the entire island, a conquest so swift and complete that it astounded his contemporaries. He then sold Cyprus to the Templars, only to seize it back when they could not hold it, ensuring the island would remain a vital Christian base in the eastern Mediterranean. At last, Richard reached the Levant. There, at the Siege of Acre, he found the crusading host in disarray, divided by rivalries and weakened by disease. Richard's arrival electrified the camp. He strode among the weary knights, commanding respect by his very presence. Though stricken by illness, he fought with ferocious energy, directing assaults, hurling stones from mangonels, and rallying the weary. In 1191, Acre fell, its Muslim defenders forced to surrender. Yet victory was marred by cruelty. When negotiations over hostages broke down, Richard ordered the execution of thousands of prisoners, a decision that stained his name even as it terrified his foes. To his supporters, it was a necessary act of war. To his enemies, it was brutality beyond measure. The Lionheart's justice was swift, and it showed no mercy. From Acre, Richard marched south, clashing with Saladin in a series of battles that tested both commanders to their limits. At Arsuf, the two titans met in open combat. Saladin's cavalry swirled like a storm, raining arrows, feigning retreats, striking and vanishing. Richard held his knights steady, refusing to be drawn into rash pursuit. Then, at the perfect moment, he unleashed the charge. The Crusader cavalry thundered forward, lances leveled, smashing into the Muslim lines. Richard himself fought in the thickest press, his sword rising and falling, his courage inspiring all. The day ended in Christian victory, and Richard's fame soared to dazzling heights. Yet Jerusalem itself eluded him. Despite victories, the march to the Holy City faltered. Supplies dwindled, the army grew weary, and Richard, ever pragmatic, recognized that to seize Jerusalem only to lose it again would be folly. He sought instead to secure the coast, fortifying strongholds that would anchor Christian power in the region. For months he sparred with Saladin in battle and diplomacy, each respecting the other as worthy adversary. Their encounters, filled with courtesy and cunning alike, became the stuff of legend, two lions circling, neither able to strike the killing blow. In 1192, Richard struck a truce with Saladin. Christian pilgrims would be allowed safe passage to Jerusalem, though the city remained under Muslim control. It was not the triumph he had dreamed, but it preserved what could be preserved. The crusade was over, and Richard prepared to return home. His journey back was as perilous as any battlefield. Shipwrecked, he traveled in disguise across hostile lands, only to be captured by Duke Leopold of Austria, whom he had insulted at Acre. Sold to the Holy Roman Emperor, Richard spent over a year in captivity, while England groaned under heavy ransom to free its absent king. Yet even in chains his legend grew, songs praising his courage spreading through Europe. Richard's reign in England was brief, for he spent little time in his kingdom, more often waging wars in France. Yet his name endured not for governance or law, but for his warrior spirit. He died in 1199, struck by a crossbow bolt while besieging a minor castle in Limousin. As the wound festered, the Lionheart met death as he had lived, with courage, confessing his sins, forgiving the archer, and facing the end unflinching. Richard left no heir, and his reign brought as much turmoil as glory, yet his legend outshone his legacy. To his contemporaries, he was the model knight, a king of unmatched valor. To later generations, he became the very image of chivalry, a figure woven into tales of Robin Hood and romantic memory. The Lionheart's roar echoes still, not in statutes or reforms, but in the stories of battlefields where banners snapped in the wind, and a king rode with sword high, fearless, indomitable, eternal. The sun rose over the Mediterranean coast in 1189, its rays spilling upon the walls of Acre, a city of immense wealth and strategic importance. For centuries, Acre had been a bustling port, a crossroads of merchants, pilgrims, and soldiers. Its stone walls rose thick and high, reinforced over decades against countless invaders. Within, markets thrived, mosques and churches shared space in tense coexistence, and the city's inhabitants, Muslim, Christian, and Jew alike, lived under the vigilance of Seljuk and Fatimid governors. To the Crusaders arriving from Europe, Acre was more than a city. It was the key to the Holy Land, the first formidable step toward Jerusalem. The siege began in earnest in August 1189, when a force of European knights, infantry, and pilgrims arrived under the banners of kings and princes. Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, and Robert of Normandy led divisions, each with his own ambitions and rivalries. The Crusaders were no unified army, but a coalition of leaders and men with overlapping and often conflicting aims. Discipline was hard-won, and the shadow of hunger and disease loomed large. Yet the cause was holy, and the men pressed forward with the promise of salvation, glory, and eternal reward. Acre's walls were formidable. The defenders had carefully repaired fortifications, built towers, and stockpiled food and weapons. From the battlements, archers rained arrows upon the approaching crusaders, while catapults hurled stones and fire. Siege engines groaned under the weight of projectiles, and ladders crashed against walls only to splinter. Early assaults ended in bloody failure. Yet the Crusaders adapted. They built siege towers, dug trenches, and blocked water supply routes to weaken the defenders. Night raids, bribery, and espionage became essential tools alongside swords and crossbows. The struggle tested both bodies and spirits. Disease spread quickly among cramped tents and unsanitary conditions. Dysentery and fever claimed more lives than combat, a grim reminder of the thin line between survival and death. Hunger gnawed at men, forcing the armies to ration what little they had. Some knights, famed for courage, were driven to desperation, raiding nearby villages for provisions, sometimes clashing with local populations or even each other. Leadership was a constant struggle. Raymond of Toulouse, older and proud, chafed at the authority of younger warriors like Richard the Lionheart. Disputes over command, strategy, and spoils threatened to unravel the army. Letters from Europe urged haste, but the slow, grinding reality of siege warfare could not be hurried. Despite these tensions, a shared sense of purpose held the coalition together, at least temporarily. Months passed, and the city held firm. Then, in 1191, Richard arrived from Cyprus, bringing disciplined troops, siege engines, and vast resources. His presence transformed the Crusaders' prospects. The Lionheart assessed the situation with keen eyes, quickly understanding that brute force alone would not suffice. He organized coordinated assaults, ensured supply lines remained secure, and leveraged both diplomacy and intimidation to weaken the city's resolve. The siege turned into a prolonged ordeal, one that would see horrors unimaginable to modern eyes. Chroniclers tell of catapults hurling corpses over walls to spread disease, of prisoners executed when negotiations failed, and of fire-consuming portions of the city. Both sides suffered immense casualties. Every day was a battle, not just against the enemy, but against hunger, thirst, disease, and exhaustion. Yet the Crusaders pressed relentlessly, their faith and determination driving them onward. Negotiations played a key role. Muslim leaders within Acre were aware that their fate depended on endurance and hope of relief forces. They offered to surrender if the Crusaders allowed safe passage for citizens, but mistrust ran deep. Richard and his allies demanded unconditional surrender, seeking not just the city, but dominance over the surrounding coast. A tense standoff ensued, with each side aware that a single mistake could spell catastrophe. Finally, after nearly 2 years, the city's defenders could endure no longer. Hunger and disease had weakened them, while relentless assaults had breached portions of the walls. On July 12, 1191, Acre surrendered. The gates opened, and the Crusaders poured in, their banners snapping in the wind, horns sounding, and prayers echoing. What followed was both victory and atrocity. Thousands of defenders were executed, a grim testament to the ruthlessness of medieval warfare. The city was secured, a critical foothold for further operations toward Jerusalem. The fall of Acre had far-reaching consequences. It demonstrated the effectiveness of disciplined siege warfare, the necessity of leadership, and the brutal realities of medieval military campaigns. It solidified Richard's reputation as a commander of unmatched skill, whose strategic acumen and fearlessness inspired loyalty and fear in equal measure. It also sowed seeds of enduring enmity, as stories of slaughter and betrayal circulated among Christian and Muslim chroniclers alike. Beyond military matters, Acre became a focal point for trade, culture, and diplomacy. Merchants from Venice, Genoa, and Pisa flocked to the port, exchanging goods, news, and ideas. Knights established quarters within the city, fortifying positions and maintaining garrisons. Religious orders, particularly the Templars and Hospitallers, found opportunities to expand influence, providing hospitals, fortresses, and training grounds for future campaigns. Acre became not just a military prize, but a symbol of Christian presence in the Holy Land. Yet amid triumph, there were shadows. The city's capture came at tremendous cost. and Europe remained deeply divided. Rivalries among Crusader leaders continued to fester, threatening cohesion. Disease and famine reminded all that even victory demanded vigilance. And Jerusalem, the ultimate goal, still lay beyond reach, its walls held by Saladin, the Sultan whose cunning and valor would challenge every Christian advance. The siege of Acre was more than a battle. It was a crucible of courage, strategy, and faith. It forged leaders, tested soldiers, and shaped the course of the Third Crusade. For Richard the Lionheart and his fellow commanders, it marked a turning point, a moment when the dream of Jerusalem seemed within grasp, yet required patience, cunning, and sacrifices that few could endure. As the sun set over the Mediterranean, casting gold upon the battered walls and victorious banners, one could feel the weight of history in the air. Acre stood as a testament to perseverance and brutality alike, a stage upon which courage, ambition, and faith collided. And in that collision, the story of the Crusades, of knights and kings, of lionhearts and sultans, surged ever onward, shaping the destiny of Europe and the Holy Land for generations to come. In the arid hills and sun-scorched plains of the Levant, a figure emerged whose name would inspire both awe and fear across two continents. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the Christian world as Saladin. Born in Tikrit in 1137, Saladin grew up amid the turbulence of the Zengid dynasty, witnessing the endless struggle between Muslim rulers and Crusader states. From an early age, he displayed intellect discipline and an unyielding sense of justice that would guide him through conquest diplomacy and the sacred duty to defend Jerusalem, the city that all of Christendom dreamed of, but he vowed would remain in Muslim hands. Saladin's rise was as methodical as it was swift. Trained in the arts of war under the tutelage of his uncle Shirkuh, a general in Egypt, Saladin absorbed every lesson in strategy, siegecraft, and statecraft. He learned not only how to command armies, but how to govern, to inspire loyalty, to cultivate respect among allies, and to impose order on conquered lands. By 1174, he became Sultan of Egypt after the death of his uncle and the young ruler's cautious consolidation. From the fertile Nile Valley, he extended his power northward into Syria, skillfully absorbing territories held by rival Muslim leaders and fortifying them against both internal and external threats. Yet Saladin's true purpose lay in the liberation of Jerusalem. The city, sacred to Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike, had fallen to the Crusaders nearly a century earlier, and since then, waves of Christian armies had sought to expand their foothold across the Levant. Saladin's vision was clear: unify the Muslim world against the invaders, reclaim Jerusalem, and restore its sanctity. To achieve this, he employed a blend of strategic brilliance and moral authority, earning him the loyalty of soldiers, the respect of scholars, and the cautious admiration of enemies. By the time the Third Crusade loomed on the horizon, Saladin had already become a figure of legend. His forces were disciplined, his fortresses formidable, and his intelligence network sophisticated. Unlike the often divided Christian princes, Saladin maintained cohesion among the Muslim rulers of Egypt, Syria, and surrounding regions. His diplomacy balanced firmness with mercy, as when he integrated rival factions rather than crushing them, binding them to his vision with both persuasion and force. The threat of Richard the Lionheart and the Crusaders arriving from Europe was met with careful calculation. Saladin knew the prowess of the Western Knights, their ferocity, their discipline, their obsession with honor. He prepared accordingly, reinforcing the walls of Jerusalem, stockpiling provisions, and fortifying positions across the surrounding hills. Patrols scouted constantly, harassing Crusader positions, and his cavalry, famed for mobility and skill, became the eyes and ears of his strategy. When news arrived of the fall of Acre in 1191, Saladin's response was measured but resolute. He mourned the loss of a critical port, but understood that victory would ultimately require patience. He avoided rash confrontation with the still weary Crusader armies, instead harrying supply lines, cutting off reinforcements, and launching skirmishes to weaken morale. He knew that the longer he held Jerusalem intact, the more opportunities would arise to strike decisively. Saladin's personal qualities shaped every decision. He was pious, disciplined, and generous, often feeding the poor and maintaining strict justice in his territories. Chroniclers describe him riding among his troops, encouraging them with words as much as with deeds, treating prisoners with mercy when possible, and displaying an almost uncanny combination of rigor and compassion. His presence inspired confidence and loyalty. Men would follow him across deserts and battlefields, knowing that their commander was both wise and fearless. Yet Saladin was not merely a strategist. He was a man of vision. To him, the defense of Jerusalem was not solely a military campaign, but a spiritual mission. The city was the heart of Muslim reverence, and its safety symbolized the unity and strength of the Islamic world. His letters to allies and envoys often blended tactical detail with appeals to faith, emphasizing honor, divine favor, and duty. His understanding of morale and symbolism matched his grasp of siege engines and cavalry maneuvers. When Richard the Lionheart finally advanced, the two titans never clashed in full-scale battle at Jerusalem, yet their campaigns intersected in skirmishes, ambushes, and strategic maneuvers across the Levant. At Arsuf and Jaffa, their forces met, and each tested the other's skill, courage, and patience. Saladin's avoidance of rash frontal attacks against heavily armored crusaders showcased both prudence and cunning, while his careful coordination of supply lines and reinforcements demonstrated his mastery of logistics. Saladin's greatest triumph, however, was psychological and moral. He maintained Jerusalem as a Muslim city, fortified but intact, avoiding the devastation that so often accompanied medieval conquest. His reputation for mercy towards civilians and even enemies earned him a rare respect across Europe, making him a foe to be feared yet admired. Stories spread of his fair treatment of prisoners, his refusal to desecrate holy sites, and his magnanimity in negotiation, painting a picture of a leader who balanced ferocity with humanity. The years following the fall of Acre saw a tense standoff. Crusader forces, drained by months of siege and disease, struggled to maintain momentum, while Saladin's forces remained vigilant, replenished, and disciplined. His patience was inexhaustible. He knew that time favored him. For every minor victory he allowed the Crusaders, he ensured that the strategic balance remained in his favor, preserving Jerusalem and consolidating Muslim control along the coast. Saladin's legacy as a defender of Jerusalem endured far beyond the Third Crusade. To Muslims, he became the paragon of virtue and courage, the embodiment of justice and devotion. To Europeans, he was both fearsome enemy and knightly exemplar, whose honor and skill forced respect even among those who fought him. His life demonstrated that true power lay not merely in weapons, but in wisdom, faith, and the ability to inspire loyalty across diverse lands. In the shadow of Jerusalem's walls, amid the arid plains and olive groves, Saladin's presence was absolute. He had preserved the city, unified the fractured Muslim world, and faced the might of Christendom with a combination of strategy, piety, and courage that would echo through history. The city remained his to defend, a symbol of the enduring struggle between faiths, and the man who held it became a legend whose story, like Jerusalem itself, would never fade. The road from Acre to Jerusalem stretched across a landscape both breathtaking and forbidding. Rolling hills, olive groves, and sun-scorched plains alternated with jagged ridges and narrow valleys, each step a test of endurance for the Crusader host. For months, Richard the Lionheart and his army had maintained a fragile foothold along the coast. Now, the ultimate goal loomed before them: the city of Jerusalem, shining like a distant jewel atop its hill, defended by the cunning and unyielding Saladin. The march was not merely a matter of moving men and horses, it was a monumental logistical challenge. Tens of thousands of soldiers, along with camp followers, supply wagons, and pilgrims, needed food, water, and shelter. Horses required fodder, weapons needed repair, and scouts had to reconnoiter every hill and valley. Disease stalked the camp, with dysentery, fever, and exhaustion claiming as many lives as skirmishes. Yet the army pressed on, its banners snapping in the wind, its men singing hymns that mingled hope and fear, prayer and steel. The terrain itself was an adversary. Narrow passes forced columns to stretch thin, making them vulnerable to ambush. Heat and dust drained strength, and sudden storms could turn dry gullies into torrents of mud. Richard, ever the warrior king, led from the front. His presence inspired the men, his sword flashing to rally morale, his keen eyes spotting danger long before it arrived. Knights rode alongside infantry, while archers and crossbowmen provided cover, a coordinated force honed by months of campaign. Saladin, ever vigilant, shadowed the Crusaders' progress. His cavalry harassed supply lines, striking swiftly and vanishing into the hills. Ambushes at dawn and dusk tested the discipline of Richard's army. The Lionheart countered with disciplined formations, fortified encampments, and clever use of terrain. The march was as much a battle of wits as of arms, each side seeking to outmaneuver the other without risking the decisive engagement that could tip the balance entirely. Morale waxed and waned with the land and weather. After days of grueling heat, thirst, and skirmishes, the sight of Jerusalem's walls brought awe and anxiety in equal measure. The city seemed impregnable from a distance, its stone towers glinting in the sunlight, its gates heavy and guarded, and its defenders ready for the final confrontation. Soldiers whispered of the city's sanctity, recalling tales of Christ's passion and the miraculous relics within. Pilgrims prayed fervently, hoping that their suffering would be rewarded with the sight of the Holy Sepulchre. Richard's leadership was tested daily. He balanced the demands of his lords, the expectations of his soldiers, and the pressure of a campaign that could not fail. Disputes erupted over strategy and rations. Nobles quarreled over precedence in the march. Men grew impatient with the slow progress. Yet the Lionheart's charisma and decisiveness kept the army united. His orders were clear, his courage visible, and his determination absolute. To falter now would be to squander years of effort and thousands of lives. As the army drew closer, the first fortified positions appeared. Outposts and small castles manned by Saladin's troops. These were not mere obstacles. They were lessons in patience, reconnaissance, and siegecraft. Richard's forces had to reduce each position systematically, using ladders, siege towers, and battering rams. Archers fired volleys to suppress defenders, while engineers dug trenches and undermined walls. The pace was slow and grueling, but with each victory, the army inched closer to its ultimate prize. The human cost was immense. Men died from wounds, exhaustion, and disease. Horses collapsed from overwork. Food shortages forced rationing, and the cries of the sick and dying echoed in the camp. Yet hope and faith pressed the survivors onward. Priests and chaplains accompanied every column, blessing banners, tending the wounded and encouraging the faithful. Soldiers and pilgrims alike looked to Richard not only as a king, but as a symbol of divine favor, believing that the Lionheart's courage mirrored the will of God. Along the way, the Crusaders encountered local populations, Muslims, Jews, and Christians, each navigating the shifting tides of power. Diplomacy and intimidation went hand in hand. Richard ensured that friendly villages were protected, supplies purchased or secured, and that hostile forces faced swift retribution. Letters and emissaries carried messages of both warning and negotiation, a subtle game of psychological warfare accompanying the physical struggle. By the time the army reached the outskirts of Jerusalem, months of marching, fighting, and surviving had hardened men into a cohesive force, though weary and diminished. The sight of the city inspired both awe and dread. Its walls rose high and imposing, its gates bristled with defenders, and the knowledge of Saladin's vigilance reminded the Crusaders that their greatest challenge still lay ahead. On the eve of the siege, soldiers camped on the plains below Jerusalem, tending weapons, praying, and preparing for the assault. Richard inspected his forces personally, walking among the men, offering words of encouragement, and ensuring that siege engines and ladders were ready. In his heart burned the desire not merely to capture a city, but to fulfill a sacred duty, to strike a blow for Christendom, and to etch his name into history. The march to Jerusalem was more than a military maneuver. It was a journey through exhaustion, hope, and faith. Every hill, valley, and stream bore witness to the courage, ingenuity, and resilience of the Crusader host. By the time the sun rose over the city, it was clear that the long-awaited confrontation was near. The army stood poised, swords gleaming, banners snapping, prayers whispered into the warm air. The siege of Jerusalem, the climax of the Third Crusade, was about to begin, a defining moment that would test the mettle of kings, knights, and soldiers alike. The sun blazed mercilessly over the Judean hills as the Crusader army gathered before Jerusalem in the summer of 1099. Though years of marching, fighting, and enduring privation had worn down men and horses alike, their spirits surged with anticipation and dread. Jerusalem, the ultimate prize of the First Crusade, loomed atop its rocky hill, a city of gold and stone, glistening under the sunlight, fortified with walls and towers that had withstood generations of invaders. Within, the defenders, bolstered by knowledge of the terrain and Saladin's enduring influence, prepared for a struggle that would determine the fate of Christendom. The Crusaders knew that this siege would test everything they had endured. Months of campaigning had honed their discipline, but exhaustion, hunger, and disease had left many weak and desperate. Yet hope and faith were stronger than fatigue. Pilgrims whispered prayers as knights adjusted armor and sharpened swords. Engineers and laborers worked feverishly, building siege engines, ramps, and ladders, while scouts and spies gathered intelligence on the city's defenses. Every element of the army moved with purpose, aware that failure here would mean not only personal loss, but the shattering of a sacred mission. Richard the Lionheart, though still recovering from months of campaigning, observed the preparations with keen eyes. Every detail mattered. Siege towers needed to be positioned precisely. Ladders had to reach the walls at the right angle. Supply lines had to remain intact under the unrelenting sun. The Lionheart rode among the troops, his presence a rallying point, his sword a symbol of resolve. Godfrey of Bouillon, equally determined, coordinated the infantry, ensuring that the less experienced men could maintain formation under constant threat. Raymond of Toulouse and other nobles led their own contingents, each contributing to the combined effort, yet also mindful of personal glory and honor. The defenders were equally resolute. Jerusalem's garrison, comprised of seasoned soldiers and volunteers, fortified the walls with ingenuity. Towers bristled with archers and crossbowmen. Boiling oil and stones were prepared to repel attackers. Citizens dug trenches and reinforced gates, aware that the city's survival depended on their unity. The streets, narrow and twisting, became traps for those who might breach the outer defenses. Every stone seemed alive with history, every wall a testament to generations of guardianship. The initial assaults began with the coordination of siege engines. Mangonels hurled stones against the gates and walls, battering towers while soldiers advanced under cover. Archers provided suppression fire, while knights and infantry prepared to storm the breaches. The air was filled with the roar of engines, the clash of metal, and the shouts of men driven by fear and fervor alike. Despite repeated attempts, the defenders repelled the first waves, demonstrating not only strength, but cunning. Boiling oil poured from the battlements, arrows rained upon ladders, and counterattacks threw the Crusaders back time and again. Days turned into a tense rhythm of assault, reinforcement, and repair. The Crusaders rotated units to maintain pressure while allowing exhausted men to rest. Engineers worked night and day, repairing damaged towers and refining strategies to scale the walls. Pilgrims offered prayers at makeshift altars, chanting for divine intervention. Letters sent to Europe urged reinforcements and promised glory, further motivating the weary yet determined army. Richard and Godfrey realized that brute force alone would not secure victory. They employed psychological tactics, feigned retreats, deceptive displays of strength, and threats aimed at weakening the defenders' morale. Negotiations were attempted, though the city's leaders remained steadfast, unwilling to surrender to what they saw as an overwhelming foreign force. The stage was set for the final decisive push. On July 15, 1099, the Crusaders launched their ultimate assault. Siege towers rolled forward, ladders clashed against the walls, and knights surged into the breaches. The streets of Jerusalem became a battlefield of chaotic violence. Chroniclers later wrote of blood flowing like rivers, of walls conquered only to be defended again, of men fighting with desperate courage under the relentless sun. The defenders, though valiant, were gradually overwhelmed by the sheer determination and numbers of the Crusaders. When the gates finally fell, a tide of soldiers poured into the city. The capture of Jerusalem was marked by both jubilation and horror. Crusaders sought vengeance for years of suffering and deprivation, executing defenders en masse. The streets ran with blood, and the cries of the fallen mingled with hymns of triumph. To the victors, it was divine justice. To the vanquished, a catastrophe of unimaginable scale. Pilgrims flocked to the church of the Holy Sepulchre, tears streaming as they touched the stones where Christ had walked, praying for salvation and giving thanks for what they believed was God's favor. Richard and Godfrey emerged as symbols of triumph. Godfrey refused to wear a crown in the city where Christ had worn thorns, styling himself instead as the defender of the Holy Sepulchre. Richard, though less present in this moment than in later campaigns, had orchestrated assaults and strategy that ensured success. Their names would echo across Europe, immortalized in songs, chronicles, and the dreams of knights yet unborn. The siege left a city forever changed. Jerusalem, while conquered, had been transformed into a stronghold of Christian power in the Holy Land. The Crusader states were established, trade routes secured, and military fortifications strengthened. Yet beneath the triumph lay the shadows of human cost. Thousands dead, families broken, cultures displaced. The moral and spiritual weight of the conquest would haunt both the victors and the vanquished, leaving a legacy of both reverence and regret. The siege of Jerusalem became emblematic of the First Crusade, a triumph born of faith, strategy, and sheer will, but tempered by the harsh realities of medieval warfare. It demonstrated the lengths to which men and women would go in pursuit of belief and glory, and the enduring power of cities, symbols, and history to shape human destiny. As the banners of the Crusaders fluttered over the holy city, one could feel the resonance of centuries echoing through stone streets, echoing in the hearts of men, and echoing in the future of Christendom and the Islamic world alike. The conquest of Jerusalem had brought triumph to the Crusaders, but victory was only the beginning. The newly established Crusader states, including the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa, required governance, fortification, and careful diplomacy. Life in these states was a delicate balance between the demands of faith, the necessities of survival, and the constant threat of surrounding Muslim powers, led by the formidable Saladin. Jerusalem itself, though consecrated by victory, was a city of contrasts. Its golden walls gleamed under the Levantine sun, but its streets bore the scars of conquest. Stone buildings that had survived for centuries now showed damage from siege engines and fire. The local population, a mosaic of Muslims, Jews, and Eastern Christians, faced drastic changes. Some fled, seeking safety in surrounding regions. Others remained under the rule of the Crusaders, navigating a new reality where their lives and livelihoods depended on submission or cooperation. The Crusaders brought their own customs, laws, and hierarchy to the city. Knights established military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers being the most prominent, tasked with defending pilgrims, fortifying strongholds, and administering justice. Castles were erected across the hills and plains, imposing stone fortifications that projected power and deterred potential attackers. Within these castles, life was rigidly structured. Training, worship, and service were daily routines, interspersed with the management of resources, defense strategies, and administration. Daily life in Jerusalem was a mix of devotion, duty, and danger. Pilgrims traveled to the Holy Sepulchre, praying for forgiveness and guidance, while merchants arrived from Europe, Byzantium, and the wider Levant, bringing spices, silks, and manuscripts. Markets thrived under the watchful eyes of knights, where the languages of many lands mingled in a tapestry of commerce. Yet tension simmered constantly. The Crusaders were a minority ruling over a diverse population, and every interaction required negotiation, force, or diplomacy to maintain order. For the knights, life was a relentless routine of vigilance and combat readiness. Armies rotated garrisons along the borders, patrols scouted the surrounding hills, and sieges or skirmishes were a constant reality. Training never ceased. Swordplay, archery, horseback maneuvers, and castle defense were daily necessities. Discipline was enforced rigorously. Any lapse could mean death not only for the individual knight, but for the civilians and pilgrims under their protection. The military orders played a critical role beyond mere combat. The Templars, sworn to poverty, chastity, and obedience, managed finances, oversaw fortifications, and trained new recruits. The Hospitallers, while equally martial, maintained hospitals, provided care for the sick and injured, and offered sanctuary to pilgrims. Their influence extended throughout the Crusader states, creating a network of security, religion, and governance that helped stabilize the region, at least temporarily. Politics in the Crusader states were as complex as the geography. Kings, princes, and nobles often pursued personal ambitions alongside the collective mission of defending Christendom. Rivalries between leaders sometimes erupted into open conflict, weakening unity. Diplomacy with neighboring Muslim states required cunning, negotiation, and occasionally concessions. Alliances shifted with the seasons, treaties were signed and broken, and intelligence about enemy movements became as vital as any sword or siege engine. The local population adapted in various ways. Many Muslims and Jews remained under Christian rule, often paying tribute or taxes while continuing religious practices in private or in designated areas. Some Christians from the East, such as the Orthodox and Armenian communities, navigated complex allegiances, balancing loyalty to their own leaders with submission to the new Latin authorities. Cultural exchanges occurred, sometimes harmonious, sometimes strained, as architecture, language, and trade blended elements of European and Levantine traditions. Religious devotion infused daily life. Churches and chapels were constructed, often on or near sites of significance to both Crusaders and locals. Monastic communities flourished, maintaining libraries, copying manuscripts, and preserving knowledge amid the turmoil of conquest. Festivals, processions, and ritual observances punctuated the routine, blending the sacred with the practical, providing structure and purpose in a region marked by conflict. Yet even amid routine, danger was never far. Muslim forces under Saladin and his generals remained vigilant, ready to challenge the Crusader states' holdings. Raids and sieges were a persistent threat, and intelligence about enemy movements required constant attention. Knights patrolled fortified roads, and outlying villages were garrisoned to resist incursions. Life in the Crusader states was a perpetual balancing act. Expansion, defense, governance, and the management of a diverse, sometimes hostile population. Despite these challenges, the Crusader states endured for decades, a testament to resilience, adaptability, and sheer determination. They became a unique fusion of European and Levantine culture, where the swords of knights protected pilgrims, markets flourished under vigilant eyes, and faith guided both ruler and ruled. The experience of life in these states, however temporary, demonstrated the complexities of conquest, the interplay of military prowess, diplomacy, cultural integration, and spiritual devotion that shaped the medieval world. Jerusalem, as the heart of the Crusader states, stood as both a triumph and a warning. Its golden walls symbolized the reach of European ambition and the devotion of those who sought to defend faith with steel. Yet its streets, markets, and courts revealed the intricate web of human lives, cultures, and relationships that had been altered forever by conquest. Life in the Crusader states was not merely about battle and victory. It was about survival, adaptation, and the pursuit of order amid the chaos of a contested land. The story of the Crusader states was, in essence, a story of human resilience and complexity. It reflected the courage, ambition, and faith of men and women caught between worlds, forced to navigate the tensions of war and peace, faith and politics, conquest and coexistence. In this crucible, the foundations of medieval power, diplomacy, and culture were forged, leaving a legacy that would echo for centuries in both Europe and the Middle East. The summer heat pressed down on the plains of Arsuf, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of salt from the Mediterranean, and the distant promise of conflict. Richard I of England, the Lionheart, rode at the head of his knights, a figure of resolute authority, his armor glinting in the sun, eyes scanning the horizon. Before him lay Saladin's forces, a disciplined and formidable army, expert in the use of cavalry, archery, and swift maneuvers. Here, two of the greatest military minds of the medieval world were about to meet. Not in a single decisive engagement, but in a series of maneuvers, skirmishes, and clashes that would define the Third Crusade. Richard's army, though fatigued from months of marching and previous sieges, maintained remarkable cohesion. The Lionheart had drilled his men relentlessly, instilling discipline, coordination, and mutual reliance. Knights and infantry marched in precise formations. Cavalry flanked with agility. Archers provided covering fire, and engineers were poised to respond to any unexpected challenge. Every detail mattered. In a conflict of this scale, the difference between victory and catastrophe lay in preparation and foresight. Saladin, ever vigilant, observed from the opposing hills. His army, a mix of seasoned soldiers and newly levied troops, was well disciplined and experienced in the art of harassment and psychological warfare. Light cavalry patrolled the flanks, archers peppered enemy columns with arrows, and infantry units prepared to reinforce any weak point. Saladin's genius lay in patience. He knew when to strike and when to wait, how to lure enemies into disadvantageous positions, and how to conserve strength for decisive moments. The clash began with subtle maneuvers. Skirmishes erupted along the roads leading to Arsuf, with Saladin's forces probing the Crusader lines, seeking weakness. Arrows rained upon the advancing columns. Ambushes in narrow passes tested discipline. Yet Richard's careful organization allowed the army to absorb these strikes. Cavalry countercharges and disciplined infantry squares repelled attacks, while engineers and sappers reinforced vulnerable points. Each encounter was a test of nerve, skill, and coordination, a chess game played with swords, spears, and steel. By the third day, the fighting intensified. Saladin ordered a major cavalry attack, aiming to split the Crusader formation and exploit exhaustion. Horsemen surged, their banners snapping in the wind, the thunder of hooves echoing across the plains. Richard anticipated the move, rallying his knights into countercharges, using terrain to limit the enemy's mobility, and directing archers to disrupt formations. The resulting clash was chaotic and brutal, the air filled with the clash of steel, the screams of the wounded, and the roar of commanders. Amid the battle, Richard's personal courage became legend. He rode at the forefront, inspiring his men with fearless leadership, cutting down enemy combatants with precision. Knights and squires fought with renewed vigor, inspired by the sight of their king standing firm despite overwhelming odds. Yet Richard's genius extended beyond bravery. He coordinated reserves, reinforced faltering lines, and used deceptive feints to lure Saladin's forces into traps. Every action reflected not only skill, but an understanding of human psychology, discipline, and battlefield dynamics. Saladin, for his part, demonstrated patience and mastery. He withdrew at opportune moments, avoided rash frontal assaults, and ensured his forces remained cohesive. He monitored Richard's maneuvers carefully, sending reinforcements where needed, harassing supply lines, and waiting for signs of weakness. Unlike many medieval commanders, he recognized the value of measured engagement, knowing that attrition, fatigue, and strategic positioning could achieve victory without unnecessary losses. The Battle of Arsuf was as much about endurance as about immediate tactics. Both sides suffered casualties. Men collapsed from exhaustion, arrows struck with lethal precision, and the heat claimed lives alongside the sword. Yet the determination of the Crusaders, bolstered by Richard's leadership, eventually forced Saladin to retreat in good order, preserving his army for future engagements while conceding the field. The Lionheart's tactical brilliance had secured a hard-fought victory, demonstrating the effectiveness of disciplined European heavy cavalry against the mobile, coordinated forces of the Muslim world. The aftermath of the battle revealed the deeper dimensions of this clash. Both leaders recognized mutual respect in each other's skill and courage. Saladin praised the bravery and tenacity of the Crusaders, while Richard acknowledged the strategic acumen and humanity of his opponent. Letters and envoys carried messages of honor and negotiation, laying the groundwork for the uneasy truces and exchanges that would define the later stages of the crusade. Both men understood that the war was not simply about bloodshed, but about strategy, faith, and the long-term projection of power. Beyond the battlefield, Arsuf influenced the morale, politics, and future strategy of the Third Crusade. Richard's reputation as a masterful commander was solidified, his legend growing in Europe as tales of his bravery and tactical genius spread. Saladin's image likewise became larger than life, a paragon of leadership, piety, and skill, who could face the mightiest of foes without fear or rashness. Their confrontation illustrated that medieval warfare was not merely brute force, but a complex interplay of psychology, logistics, strategy, and personal courage. The clash at Arsuf also highlighted the broader human cost of war. Thousands of soldiers perished, fields were trampled, and local populations were affected by the movement of armies. Disease, hunger, and exposure took as many lives as swords, a grim reminder that the heroism of knights and the strategy of commanders existed alongside human suffering. Yet these costs were tempered by acts of mercy and restraint. Both leaders, though hardened by battle, exercised judgment in sparing prisoners and civilians whenever practical, adding nuance to the narrative of medieval combat. In the end, the clash of titans at Arsuf was more than a military engagement. It was a meeting of wills, intellects, and faiths. Richard and Saladin, through strategy, courage, and foresight, demonstrated the heights of leadership, the complexity of medieval warfare, and the enduring resonance of honor and reputation. For the soldiers who fought, the pilgrims who watched, and the chroniclers who recorded every moment, Arsuf became a defining episode of the Crusades, a testament to human courage, ingenuity, and the intricate interplay of fate, skill, and destiny on the stage of history. The scorched plains and fortified cities of the Levant bore witness not only to the clash of swords, but also to the delicate art of negotiation, diplomacy, and compromise. After months of relentless campaigns, sieges, and battles, the Third Crusade reached a stage where strategy extended beyond the battlefield. Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, two of the most formidable figures of the era, understood that victory was not simply about conquest. It was also about forging temporary peace, securing positions, and protecting both soldiers and civilians from the ravages of continuous warfare. Following the intense confrontations at Arsuf and Jaffa, both leaders faced the practical realities of prolonged conflict. Crusader forces, though disciplined and courageous, were far from invincible. Many knights and infantry were exhausted, supplies strained, and reinforcements limited by the vast distance from Europe. Similarly, Saladin's forces had endured repeated clashes, logistical challenges, and the need to maintain cohesion among diverse troops spread across Egypt, Syria, and Palestine. Both commanders recognized that a full-scale assault on heavily fortified cities could be costly, if not catastrophic. Diplomatic channels opened cautiously. Envoys traveled across hostile terrain, carrying messages in Latin, Arabic, and Persian, negotiating not only terms, but the subtleties of honor, faith, and intention. Richard, despite his reputation for decisiveness and martial valor, was equally astute in diplomacy. He knew that Jerusalem itself might remain beyond immediate reach, but securing coastal cities, supply lines, and temporary truces could consolidate Crusader power. Saladin, for his part, balanced firmness with flexibility. He understood the political and religious significance of Jerusalem, but also the practical necessity of avoiding attrition that could weaken Muslim positions irreparably. The negotiations were often tense, marked by mistrust, strategic bluffing, and careful observation of the opponent's demeanor. Richard sent letters emphasizing the righteousness of the Crusader cause, while subtly signaling his readiness to escalate if terms were not met. Saladin replied with appeals to honor, shared faith, and the principles of justice, reminding the Crusaders of the resilience of Muslim holdings and the consequences of unnecessary bloodshed. Every word was weighted, every gesture scrutinized. The art of diplomacy became as crucial as any battlefield maneuver. Temporary truces were negotiated to allow both sides to tend to the wounded, resupply forces, and fortify positions. These pauses in fighting were tense, as neither side fully trusted the other. Scouts and spies observed movements even during negotiations, ready to alert commanders to any hint of treachery. Yet paradoxically, these truces also allowed moments of humanity to surface. Prisoners were exchanged, messages of mutual respect were communicated, and both sides gained a clearer understanding of their enemy's intentions and capabilities. Jerusalem itself remained a focal point of negotiation. Saladin's control of the city was non-negotiable in principle, yet he understood that allowing limited access for Christian pilgrims could placate European sentiment and reduce the likelihood of reckless attacks. Richard, while desperate to claim the city, recognized the limits of his reach and the immense cost a full assault would entail. Their mutual pragmatism allowed for the establishment of protocols regarding pilgrimage, safe passage, and the administration of conquered territories along the coast. The interplay of diplomacy and warfare demonstrated the complexity of medieval politics. Leaders had to balance religious imperatives, military realities, and personal honor. Richard's charisma, decisiveness, and reputation for courage made him a negotiator whose threats carried weight, while Saladin's piety, wisdom, and fairness earned him respect even among enemies. Both understood that long-term outcomes were as important as short-term victories. The perception of justice, restraint, and honor influenced not only immediate decisions, but the legacy of their campaigns. Amid the formal negotiations, daily life in the contested territories continued. Crusader garrisons patrolled newly captured towns, fortifications were reinforced, and civilians navigated the shifting balance of power. Trade resumed cautiously under the watchful eyes of soldiers, markets opened, and religious ceremonies continued, reflecting the persistence of human life even amid the specter of war. Envoys and negotiators became indispensable, bridging cultural, linguistic, and religious divides, translating not only words but intent, tone, and nuance. One notable episode involved the exchange of prisoners after a skirmish near Jaffa. Saladin insisted on humane treatment, reflecting both strategic calculation and personal principle. Richard reciprocated, ensuring the release of Muslim captives in recognition of Saladin's reputation for honor. These exchanges, chroniclers noted, were more than formalities. They reinforced the mutual respect between the leaders, demonstrated the possibility of ethical conduct even in brutal campaigns, and influenced the perception of both sides across Europe and the Middle East. Negotiations also extended to matters of succession, territorial control, and military cooperation with allied states. Crusader leaders debated the allocation of lands, the responsibilities of knights, and the establishment of defensive networks. Saladin coordinated with Syrian and Egyptian governors, balancing loyalty, power, and the necessity of maintaining unity against a technologically and tactically formidable enemy. The diplomacy of the era was a constant exercise in juggling competing interests, predicting enemy behavior, and leveraging moral and religious authority to achieve tangible results. These strategic truces and negotiations ultimately shaped the trajectory of the Third Crusade. While Jerusalem itself remained under Saladin's control, the Crusaders secured key coastal cities, established supply lines, and demonstrated that European forces could operate effectively in the Levant. The personal rivalry and mutual respect between Richard and Saladin became legendary, a story that would echo for centuries as an example of leadership, honor, and the complex interplay between war and diplomacy. In the end, the negotiations were as decisive as any battle. They preserved armies, prevented unnecessary devastation, and allowed both leaders to pursue objectives without catastrophic losses. Richard returned to Europe with a reputation cemented by both valor and prudence, while Saladin maintained the integrity of his realm, his prestige undiminished. Their diplomatic engagement illustrated that medieval conflict was not merely a contest of strength, but also of intellect, strategy, and moral authority. A delicate dance that shaped history as much as any sword or siege engine. The waning years of the Third Crusade were marked by a relentless series of campaigns, skirmishes, and strategic maneuvers that tested every facet of leadership, courage, and endurance. Richard the Lionheart, though weary from years of campaigning, remained a figure of indomitable will, driving his knights and soldiers forward along the coastal cities and arid plains of the Levant. Saladin, equally steadfast, marshaled his forces with precision, coordinating garrisons, reinforcing cities, and preparing for confrontations that could shape the fate of the Holy Land for generations. The coastal cities, Jaffa, Acre, and Arsuf, became central theaters of this stage. Richard sought to secure supply lines and fortify positions that would sustain the Crusaders while providing strategic bases for operations deeper inland. Siege engines and fortifications were erected meticulously, with engineers and masons working tirelessly to reinforce walls, construct towers, and ensure safe passages for troops and supplies. Every detail was scrutinized. A single weak point could invite disaster. Saladin's response was measured but persistent. Light cavalry raids harried supply caravans, while reconnaissance units scouted the Crusader encampments. He deployed archers and infantry strategically to slow advances and test the defenses of key positions. Both leaders displayed remarkable restraint. Despite fierce engagements, neither committed to a full-scale confrontation that could annihilate the other, understanding the broader implications of attrition and morale. Richard's personal courage and tactical genius remained central to the campaigns. Leading from the front, he inspired his knights with both fearlessness and calculated risk. Cavalry charges were timed with precision, infantry formations held ground under relentless assaults, and archers executed coordinated volleys that disrupted enemy movements. The campaigns were a blend of psychology and brute force, intimidation, feigned retreats, and sudden strikes shaped the battlefield as much as swords and arrows. The final campaigns also highlighted the logistical and human challenges of medieval warfare. Supplies were finite, and the desert heat exhausted men and horses alike. Disease and fatigue claimed lives alongside combat. Richard's army relied on local foraging, shipments from European allies, and careful rationing, yet the strain was constant. Saladin faced similar pressures, balancing the needs of his commanders, maintaining the loyalty of distant garrisons, and ensuring the flow of reinforcements from Egypt and Syria. Every decision had consequences for both survival and morale. Despite the constant tension of conflict, moments of diplomacy and mutual respect persisted. Truces allowed both sides to regroup, tend to the wounded, and consolidate positions. Richard and Saladin exchanged envoys, negotiating access for pilgrims, treatment of prisoners, and temporary agreements on territories. These diplomatic interludes were essential, providing respite amid the chaos and further cementing the legendary reputation of both leaders as commanders who combined martial prowess with strategic wisdom. One notable engagement occurred near Jaffa, where Saladin's forces attempted to recapture the city. Richard, anticipating the attack, prepared defensive positions, deploying infantry to guard gates, archers along the walls, and cavalry in reserve for countercharges. The battle unfolded with extraordinary coordination. Saladin's cavalry pressed relentlessly, yet every feint and maneuver was countered by Richard's disciplined forces. Ultimately, the city held, a testament to the skill, leadership, and resilience of the Crusaders. The campaigns also reflected the broader cultural and religious dimensions of the Crusades. Pilgrims moved cautiously along routes between cities, praying for safe passage, while local populations endured the uncertainties of occupation, conflict, and shifting allegiances. Religious leaders accompanied armies, offering counsel, tending to the sick, and interpreting the campaign as a divine mission. The clash of faiths, while violent, was interwoven with moments of shared humanity and pragmatism. As the campaigns progressed, Richard faced the reality that Jerusalem itself remained beyond immediate reach. The fortified city, held firmly by Saladin, could not be taken without immense cost in lives and resources. Strategic pragmatism dictated a focus on securing the coast, fortifying positions, and ensuring safe passage for pilgrims. Saladin, understanding the constraints of Richard's forces, negotiated terms that preserved the city while acknowledging the Crusader presence along critical points. These arrangements reflected the mature statesmanship of both men, who balanced ambition with practicality. The final campaigns also shaped the enduring legend of Richard and Saladin. Chroniclers across Europe and the Middle East recounted tales of courage, strategy, and honor. Richard's leadership exemplified the ideal of the chivalric knight, fearless, loyal, and skilled, yet capable of calculated restraint. Saladin's reputation for wisdom, piety, and magnanimity endured alongside his military genius. Their campaigns became more than historical events. They evolved into narratives of human virtue, leadership, and the complex interplay of faith and politics. As the months drew to a close, the campaigns culminated in negotiated truces and territorial settlements. The Crusader states retained key coastal cities, ensuring a European presence in the Holy Land, while Saladin maintained control over Jerusalem. Both sides claimed moral and strategic victories, and the framework for future interactions, whether conflict or negotiation, was established. The final campaigns demonstrated that medieval warfare was not merely about brute strength, but about vision, discipline, and the capacity to harmonize force, diplomacy, and human endurance. In reflection, the final campaigns of the Third Crusade were a crucible in which leadership, courage, and strategic insight were tested to their limits. They revealed the humanity behind legend, the interplay of faith and pragmatism, and the enduring complexity of conflict. The actions of Richard and Saladin, while separated by cultural and religious differences, exemplified a shared understanding of honor, strategy, and the burdens of command. Lessons that would echo through history long after the clamor of battle had faded. The journey home from the Levant was never merely a physical passage. It was a complex, perilous, and often politically charged undertaking. Richard the Lionheart, after years of campaigning across the deserts, plains, and fortified cities of the Holy Land, faced a return to Europe that would test not only his leadership, but also his resilience, cunning, and patience. Though victorious in battle and revered for his courage, the road back to England was fraught with obstacles, both human and environmental, each demanding careful navigation. Richard departed from the Levant in late 1192, having secured the Crusader states along the Levantine coast and negotiated terms with Saladin that allowed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem. Though he had failed to capture the holy city itself, his victories at Arsuf, Jaffa, and other engagements, coupled with the strategic agreements reached with Saladin, ensured that his legacy remained unblemished in the eyes of Europe. Yet the Mediterranean awaited, a realm of treacherous seas, political rivals, and unpredictable weather that could render even the greatest commander vulnerable. The voyage began with careful planning. Ships were provisioned with food, water, and equipment, while a small contingent of knights and guards accompanied the king to deter pirates or opportunistic raiders. Yet the sea was as unforgiving as any battlefield. Storms battered the fleet, splintering timbers, tossing men into the waves, and testing morale. Sailors cursed, prayed, and worked tirelessly to maintain the integrity of the vessels, aware that even a single miscalculation could result in disaster. Richard, accustomed to the unpredictability of war, remained vigilant, directing repairs, reassuring his men, and preparing contingencies for unforeseen threats. However, the greatest obstacle proved not nature, but human treachery. On the return route through Europe, Richard was betrayed by Leopold V, Duke of Austria. Leopold, still harboring resentment over perceived slights during the Crusade, captured Richard in December 1192 as he traversed through hostile territory. The king was imprisoned, first in Austria and later transferred to various castles in Germany. His fate held hostage to the ambitions and grievances of European lords. The capture sent shockwaves across Christendom, throwing England into political uncertainty and stirring anxiety among European monarchs and the papacy. Richard's imprisonment tested not only his patience, but also the loyalty and resourcefulness of his allies. England, under the stewardship of William Longchamp and later Prince John, faced internal strife and instability. Negotiations for Richard's release involved complex diplomacy, ransoms, alliances, papal intervention, and careful leverage of political influence. The king's captors demanded an exorbitant sum, 150,000 marks, a sum that represented both the wealth and dedication of his kingdom. The collection of the ransom required extraordinary measures: taxation, contributions from nobles, and the mobilization of every available resource. During his captivity, Richard endured both discomfort and indignity. Confined within castle walls, he faced the constant presence of guards, isolation from familiar surroundings, and the uncertainty of the political machinations that could determine his fate. Yet his spirit remained unbroken. Letters written in captivity reveal a mind ever engaged, contemplating strategy, governance, and the state of his kingdom. He maintained the dignity of a king even when subjected to the will of others, demonstrating the resilience and fortitude that had defined him on the battlefield. The eventual release of Richard in 1194, after a staggering ransom was paid and intricate negotiations concluded, marked a turning point in both his life and the political landscape of Europe. The sum collected represented an extraordinary burden on England and its allies, yet it also reflected the king's enduring value as a symbol of leadership, martial prowess, and the unifying force of monarchy. His return to England was celebrated with ceremonies, feasts, and public rejoicing, cementing his status as a hero of Christendom and a figure of near mythical renown. Richard's experiences during the return journey also shaped his later policies and perceptions. The lessons learned in negotiation, endurance, and the complexities of European politics informed his governance, influencing interactions with nobles, vassals, and foreign rulers. He emerged not only as a military legend, but as a monarch acutely aware of the fragility and interconnectedness of power, diplomacy, and loyalty. Beyond England, the story of Richard's return resonated throughout Europe. Chroniclers, troubadours, and historians recorded the triumphs of the Crusades, alongside the trials of his imprisonment. Tales of his courage, resilience, and strategic acumen inspired generations of knights, rulers, and citizens. Saladin, though separated by distance and faith, remained a contemporary symbol of honor, diplomacy, and military genius, ensuring that Richard's legacy would be intertwined with the narratives of the broader medieval world. The return to Europe was more than a homecoming. It was a journey of reflection, endurance, and transformation. Richard had witnessed the deserts and cities of the Holy Land, negotiated with one of history's greatest leaders, and faced the uncertainty of captivity and political intrigue. Each challenge had honed his intellect, fortified his character, and broadened his understanding of leadership. The experiences of these years would define not only his reign, but the enduring narrative of the Crusades, illuminating the complexities of faith power and human resilience, in an era where destiny was forged as much by diplomacy and endurance as by the sword. Even as he returned to the familiar landscapes of England, Richard carried with him the lessons, scars, and triumphs of distant lands. The campaigns, sieges, and diplomatic efforts had tested the limits of courage and intellect, revealing both the vulnerabilities and strengths of human endeavor. For contemporaries and future generations, the story of Richard's US return symbolized not only the endurance of a king, but the intricate tapestry of medieval life. where warfare, faith politics, and human resilience intertwined to shape history in ways both immediate and profound. The echoes of the Crusades reverberated long after the last banners were lowered. The final sieges concluded, and the armies returned to distant homelands. For Europe, the campaigns had reshaped political boundaries, social hierarchies, and religious consciousness. For the Levant, they left a complex tapestry of cultural exchange, fortified cities, and lingering tension between diverse populations. The legacy of the Crusades was not merely measured in victories or defeats, but in the enduring imprint on culture, faith, governance, and collective memory. One of the most profound impacts was the consolidation of power and prestige among European monarchs and nobility. Leaders like Richard the Lionheart emerged as paragons of chivalry, courage, and strategic acumen. Tales of their exploits inspired loyalty, admiration, and imitation, while their political maneuvering demonstrated the necessity of diplomacy alongside martial prowess. Kings and princes returned from the Crusades with heightened authority, their reputations enhanced not solely by conquest, but by the perception of piety, honor, and leadership. Military orders, which had played a pivotal role during the campaigns, solidified their influence in both spiritual and secular realms. The Knights Templar and Hospitallers, originally tasked with defending pilgrims and fortifying crusader holdings, evolved into powerful institutions. Their networks of castles, fortifications, and economic holdings extended across Europe and the Levant, shaping political, financial, and military landscapes for centuries. These orders became symbols of both religious devotion and disciplined martial service, embodying ideals of faith and strategic organization. Cultural exchanges, often subtle and enduring, formed another significant legacy. Crusaders encountered the advanced scholarship, medicine, engineering, and artistic traditions of the Islamic world. Cities like Acre and Jerusalem, hubs of commerce and administration, exposed European knights, clerics, and merchants to new ideas, technologies, and knowledge systems. Architectural techniques, medical practices, navigational skills, and even culinary innovations gradually filtered back to Europe, sowing seeds for intellectual and cultural transformations, including the later Renaissance. The Crusades also left an indelible mark on trade and economic structures. European demand for spices, silks, and exotic goods increased dramatically as Crusaders returned with stories of distant lands and treasures. Merchant networks expanded, ports flourished, and trade routes between Europe and the Levant became more sophisticated and secure. This commercial expansion contributed to the rise of urban centers, increased wealth among the merchant class, and the slow evolution of economic systems that would eventually transform medieval society. Religious consciousness, both in Europe and the Middle East, was profoundly shaped by the Crusades. In Europe, the campaigns reinforced the centrality of the Church in political and military affairs, demonstrating its capacity to mobilize armies, sanctify wars, and influence governance. Pilgrimage, penance, and the notion of holy obligation became intertwined with secular ambition, creating a potent framework for faith-based endeavors. In the Levant, Muslim leaders like Saladin became symbols of resistance, piety, and ethical conduct in warfare, their reputations enduring as models of honor and strategic wisdom. Yet the legacy was not solely one of triumph or enlightenment. The Crusades also generated enduring conflicts, grievances, and social disruption. Populations in the Levant experienced displacement, destruction, and cultural upheaval. Religious and ethnic tensions were intensified, leaving scars that would persist for generations. European societies, while enriched in some ways, also grappled with the loss of life, financial burdens, and the moral complexity of warfare carried out in the name of faith. The dichotomy of spiritual idealism and human cost remained a central tension in the memory of the Crusades. For individuals, the personal impact was profound. Knights returned physically scarred, financially depleted, or emotionally transformed by their experiences. Leaders like Richard, though lionized, faced the challenges of governance upon returning home, dealing with political intrigue, family ambitions, and the demands of kingdoms left in their absence. The psychological imprint of the Crusades, the trauma of battle, the moral dilemmas of command, and the lessons of endurance and diplomacy influenced not only personal narratives, but the broader understanding of leadership in medieval society. Intellectually, the Crusades prompted reflections on ethics, law, and the nature of warfare. Chroniclers recorded events with varying degrees of bias, emphasizing heroism, divine favor, or moral lessons. The experiences of the Crusades contributed to the codification of military conduct, principles of chivalry, and emerging ideas about the responsibilities of rulers and warriors. Debates on just war, the treatment of civilians, and the balance of power became increasingly sophisticated, shaping political and religious thought across generations. The architectural and urban legacy endured visibly across the Levant. Castles, fortifications, churches, and hospitals constructed or expanded during the Crusades left lasting impressions on the landscape. Cities like Acre, Tripoli, and Jerusalem bore the imprint of European military engineering alongside local design, creating a fusion of styles and defensive strategies. These constructions not only served immediate strategic purposes, but also became symbols of the cultural intersections and power dynamics that defined the era. Ultimately, the Crusades' legacy was multidimensional, a mixture of valor and tragedy, religious fervor and pragmatic diplomacy, cultural enrichment and human suffering. Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, as emblematic figures of this era, represented both the human capacity for courage and strategy and the ethical complexities of leadership. Their campaigns, negotiations, and interactions left lessons in resilience, honor, and the pursuit of objectives tempered by morality and pragmatism. The Third Crusade, in particular, crystallized themes that would echo through history: the interplay of military skill, political acumen, and cultural exchange, the tensions between idealism and practicality, and the enduring human struggle to reconcile faith, ambition, and ethical responsibility. The legacy was not confined to monuments, chronicles, or legends. It became woven into the fabric of European and Middle Eastern history, shaping identities, narratives, and understanding of the medieval world for centuries to come. The Crusades, therefore, were more than a series of wars. They were a crucible in which leaders, soldiers, and societies were tested, refined, and transformed. They highlighted the possibilities and perils of ambition, the limits and potentials of diplomacy, and the enduring resonance of human courage and ingenuity. In the stories of knights, rulers, and common people, the legacy of the Crusades endured as a testament to both the triumphs and tragedies of an era that would continue to captivate the imagination of generations. The sun dipped low over the rolling hills of England and the distant coasts of the Levant, casting long shadows across the lands that had borne witness to decades of ambition, warfare, and devotion. For Richard the Lionheart, the years of crusading, campaigning, and political intrigue had left an indelible mark, not only on the kingdoms he governed, but on his own understanding of leadership, legacy, and mortality. The Third Crusade, the battles with Saladin, the sieges, and the negotiations were now memories, yet their impact reverberated through every corner of his realm and beyond. Returning to his homeland, Richard was met by both adulation and challenge. England had changed in his absence. Taxes had been levied, regents had managed the affairs of the kingdom, and political factions had maneuvered to gain advantage. Yet his legend preceded him. Songs of his valor, chronicles of his campaigns, and tales of his strategic genius had spread across Europe, enhancing the aura of a monarch who embodied courage, chivalry, and wisdom. The Lionheart's presence alone inspired loyalty and awe, yet it also demanded the careful negotiation of power within his own courts and among his vassals. Richard's reflections extended beyond politics to the human experience of his campaigns. He had witnessed the extremes of courage and fear, mercy and cruelty, triumph and loss. Soldiers had died beside him, knights and footmen alike, and their sacrifices weighed heavily on his conscience. The moral and psychological dimensions of command, the the decisions to advance or withdraw, to show mercy or enforce discipline, to negotiate or fight, had shaped his understanding of leadership in ways that no battlefield alone could teach. These lessons, etched in memory and reinforced by experience, would inform his governance and the stories that would be told of him for generations. In the Holy Land, Saladin's legacy endured in parallel. His victories and concessions, his diplomacy and restraint, had preserved the integrity of Muslim territories while projecting the image of a leader who combined piety with pragmatism. The respect he garnered from both followers and foes reinforced the notion that leadership was measured not merely by conquest, but by honor, foresight, and the capacity to navigate complex human and political landscapes. The interactions between Richard and Saladin became emblematic of a broader understanding that even in conflict, principles, negotiation, and mutual recognition could shape history as much as swords and siege engines. The broader society of medieval Europe absorbed the lessons of the Crusades in multifaceted ways. Military orders like the Knights Templar and Hospitallers continued to fortify cities, administer lands, and influence politics. Trade expanded between Europe and the East, bringing spices, textiles, and ideas that enriched economies and stimulated cultural development. Cities grew, markets flourished, and intellectual curiosity was kindled by exposure to the art, science, and scholarship of the Islamic world. Even as these transformations occurred, the memories of warfare, hardship, and sacrifice shaped collective consciousness, embedding the Crusades into the moral and historical framework of the era. Richard's personal narrative, intertwined with these broader currents, became a touchstone for understanding leadership, courage, and human resilience. He had navigated political intrigue in Europe, led armies across continents, negotiated with one of history's most formidable opponents, and endured imprisonment and betrayal. Each experience added layers to his character. A king both feared and revered, a warrior tempered by reflection, and a ruler who recognized that victory required not only strength, but wisdom, diplomacy, and empathy. The end of the Third Crusade also marked a turning point in the relationship between Europe and the Levant. While the immediate objective of capturing Jerusalem had not been realized, the strategic positioning of the Crusader states and the negotiated access for pilgrims established a framework for coexistence, limited though it was. Religious, cultural, and military interactions continued to shape perceptions, alliances, and conflicts, influencing centuries of history that would follow. The campaigns had not concluded the clash of civilizations, but they had demonstrated the potential for honor, negotiation, and mutual respect amid profound disagreement and difference. In England, Richard's return and subsequent governance reflected the synthesis of experience and authority. He exercised sovereignty with a blend of martial decisiveness and measured diplomacy, applying lessons learned on distant battlefields to the management of lands, vassals, and international relations. Chronicles of the era recorded not only his victories, but also the wisdom and judgment evident in his handling of disputes, administration, and the delicate balance of power. The image of the Lionheart endured as a symbol of courage tempered by insight, a paradigm for leaders and chroniclers alike. Reflecting on the Crusades, one sees a world transformed by human ambition, faith, and ingenuity. The interplay of warfare, diplomacy, and cultural exchange revealed the possibilities and limitations of medieval society. Knights, soldiers, and leaders confronted not only enemy forces, but also the constraints of geography, logistics, and morality. Cities, landscapes, and people were shaped by campaigns that tested endurance, strategy, and character. From the sands of Arsuf to the walls of Acre, from the courts of Europe to the fortresses of the Levant, the Crusades left a legacy as complex and enduring as any human endeavor. As Richard contemplated the years that had passed, he recognized the profound impact of these experiences on both personal and historical scales. The battles, negotiations, sieges, and journeys had forged a legacy that transcended immediate victories or losses. They demonstrated the capacities of human courage, strategic thinking, and ethical consideration. illustrating how individuals and societies navigate the intertwined forces of ambition, faith, and circumstance. The era that Richard and Saladin inhabited came to an end not with a single climactic battle, but through reflection, diplomacy, and the quiet consolidation of achievements and understanding. Their stories, intertwined across cultures and continents, became emblematic of the complexities of human endeavor in an age defined by conflict, faith, and the pursuit of honor. The Crusades, in all their triumphs and tragedies, were remembered as a time when leadership was tested, virtues were revealed, and history was indelibly shaped by the interplay of courage, strategy, and moral resolve. In the twilight of his years, Richard the Lionheart embodied both the glories and the burdens of the Crusades. He returned not only as a conqueror of battles, but as a witness to the intricate tapestry of human experience, a world of valor, devotion, suffering, and wisdom. The end of this era marked the conclusion of one chapter in history, but the lessons, legacies, and stories endured, echoing across centuries as a testament to the enduring human struggle to balance ambition, honor, and the ethical exercise of power.